Hi everyone, I'm Alex. I'm the Director of Cloud and Engineering in Visma, and today I'm going to talk about some of the security shortcomings that I often see at smaller software companies and what can be done to address those issues. Now, in Visma we interact with loads of companies, but we interact with some companies more and in different ways than others, and that allows us to learn more deeply about their security posture. So for instance, Visma is quite active in acquiring new companies, and when we are considering companies, of course, we evaluate their security and their security posture in a deeper way. We, as a software company, we buy lots of software ourselves as well, and we do security and risk assessments for most of our vendors. And finally, there are some customers and partners that we have an even closer relationship with, and in those cases we may help them with a security incident or help them generally improve their security posture, which also allows us to learn about their current security maturity. Now in Visma we are quite lucky because we have natural incentives and pressures on us to care about security, to focus and invest in security. So for instance, in Visma we have hundreds of products that we sell to over 1 million customers, and many of those customers are large private and public sector organizations. Many of those are very professional customers, meaning that they know what to demand and ask from us. So our customers are often holding our feet to the fire also in the security area. Today Visma has about 14,000 employees, and if we're going to retain talent and get access to new and more talent, if we're going to be sustainable, we need to be known for many things, including our competence and our security competence. And if we were known as acting irresponsibly, it would be hard to recruit new people. We have professional investors, professional board members that take risk management very seriously. They are very aware of the business risk of poor security, and they follow up and they expect and they encourage us to focus on and invest in security. And finally, Visma is operating in more than a dozen countries with all the laws and regulations that implies. And of course, as a large company, we are also scrutinized by many different types of third parties, which is a good thing, of course. And all of these pressures and incentives combined help us to do what, of course, we also want to do, which is to focus on security, to make sure that we build secure services, that we process our customers' data in a secure way. But many companies, especially smaller ones, do not necessarily have those pressures and incentives to help them with this focus. And I think that for smaller companies that fit into this danger zone, we often see that security is not the focus. So for those companies that have less than 30 employees and less than 5 million euros in revenue per year, they might not have any of the incentives and pressures that we just looked at. Some of them might not even think of themselves as a software or technology company. So I think this is at least partly the explanation for why I often see smaller software companies with quite serious security problems. And I think that's very unnecessary because it doesn't take that much to fix this problem. It doesn't take much to be above average, especially among small software companies. And it's actually not that expensive to raise the security level significantly. Another good thing, if you are a developer in a small company like this, is that as one person you can have quite a big impact on the security of the company, on the security of your customers' data. So I'm going to go through the 5 most common security shortcomings that I see at small software companies. That doesn't mean that it is true for all small software companies. No. There are certainly many small and large software companies that are doing a good job on security. And there are also large companies who are doing a good job and large companies who are doing a poor job. But this is the pattern that I have seen over the last several years. So the first issue that we're going to talk about is unclear responsibility. Now, if you ask a small software company in this danger zone, who is responsible for security? Sometimes you will get a confused look. Before they get some thinking time, and after some seconds they realize, of course, that this is a question that deserves a good answer, and they usually land on one of 3 very common answers. So one possible answer is that security is everyone's responsibility in the company. And of course, to some extent this is true. It's a good answer because we want everyone in a company to have some security awareness. But it really depends on whether you can follow up this answer with concrete examples of what kind of mechanisms are used to distribute that responsibility. What kind of processes and activities is actually happening throughout the company. And very often they don't have that answer because security is not a focus currently. Similarly, another typical answer is that, well, our CEO is of course responsible for security. The CEO is responsible for everything. And yes, a CEO is accountable for everything inside a company, but unless you're 2 or 3 or 4 people, this does not really scale. So again, if you can talk about how the CEO is involved in security activities and make sure that security is a proportionally correct focus in the company, then it can be a good answer. But often there's no follow-up, and it's because security is not the focus. Now the third common answer, and maybe the scariest one, is actually security is handled by our vendor. And what they usually mean in this case is a hosting vendor or an infrastructure vendor. They might point to that their vendor has a ISO 27001 certificate, which is a good thing, but I think most of us realize that this is wholly insufficient. It's a good thing that a professional company is handling parts of the security of the production environment for this software company, let's say. Certainly a good thing. But what about everything else? The hosting company is not going to make sure that you are developing secure products. They may only think about the production environment. The hosting company is probably not going to make sure that employees in your company are not clicking links in emails and getting, falling for phishing attacks, for instance. They're not going to think about the security of the workstations of the employees, right? So an insufficient answer as well. Now, what I think that we are hoping for when we ask this question is, on the one hand, to see that the overall responsibility for security is placed in one place, so that one person is overall responsible for making sure that security is considered throughout the organization and it's a part of kind of daily business activities. But then also that security responsibility is distributed out in the organization in a reasonable way. The second most common issue is a lack of security competence. So some small software companies will actively recruit for security competence and make sure that they have that in their organization. But many do not. And in those cases, whether they have security competence in the organization is actually a function of how lucky they were in recruiting, which can be a little bit scary. So my suggestion for addressing this issue is first to do a competency mapping, if you have not done so already. Document what kind of primary skills and secondary skills you have in the management team, in the development team or teams, and see how often does security pop up. If security is not present or you find it insufficient, well, then you know what to look for in your future recruitment. But now that you have security competence in the organization, then the next question is, well, how do you encourage, how do you support, how do you further develop that security competence? Because of course things are changing fast, and it looks like many companies, especially smaller ones, are relying on developers and other professionals to stay up to date and develop their competence on their own. And many people will do that, but it would be much better if the company also actively encouraged and supported this. So, one example, if you don't have anything already, is to organize these brown bag sessions. So this is where all the people in the company or everyone in one department or team gather around for maybe during a common lunch meeting or a dedicated meeting, and someone is responsible for presenting on a security topic. So you set aside 30 or 60 minutes and you have one person that have prepared talk about one particular security threat. Maybe they show a news article that can show the impact and the harm that can be done to businesses or people because of a security vulnerability. They can then also talk about how those threats often are exploited, how then it can be mitigated. And if you do that once a week, twice a month, once a month, over time it's going to have a big impact on the competence on security in the organization. Now, if you want to take a bit of a larger step, you can organize some hands-on sessions as well. Maybe set aside half a day or a full day and allow people to get their hands dirty, where you prepare, you set up a vulnerable application of some kind. Maybe you present a little bit in the beginning of the day, and then you allow people to try to hack a vulnerable system. This is of course a very fun thing to do, very engaging, and the likelihood of retaining the information and having it have impact later is of course much bigger. So in Visma, we use OWASP Security Shepherd for this one example of a vulnerable application. And we also use Secure Code Warrior for a different type of competence development for developers. There are loads of tools like this out there. Now, the third most common problem is lack of threat awareness. So you might ask a company, well, what security threats are most relevant to you and your company? And some will have a good answer, but often that's not something that they have thought about. So what's the solution here? Well, I think the first thing, especially if you're starting from scratch, is to learn about what kind of threats are out there. And you can start with the experience in your company. Have you had any security incidents, or have you been afraid of any particular threats? That's one place to start. You can also talk to similar companies. Maybe there's an industry association that you can be part of or raise this issue, or maybe they are already communicating some advice around cybersecurity that you can take advantage of. Another possible source is to go to national or international cybersecurity authorities. They will often give useful advice as well. So you gather information, you gather some people, you brainstorm all the possible threats that are relevant to you, your company, your products, your employees. You enumerate as many as you can. And then, of course, because we all have limited budgets, we all have limited time, we cannot protect 100% against everything. We need to prioritize. So if you're starting from zero, maybe the first goal is just to get a top 3 or top 5 threats. And then, of course, the next step is to figure out how do you protect against these threats. And that brings us to, well, here's an example actually of the Cybersecurity Authority in the European Union. So there's a bunch of news articles on different types of security threats and how they can be mitigated. And I also included this one, which is a yearly report from the Norwegian National Security Authorities on the digital threat landscape for both the public and private sector. So in this year's report, they talk about supply chain attacks, they talk about brute force attacks, reuse of passwords, many other threats, and they give advice on how to protect against them. So if you have a workshop in your company, maybe you get a prioritized list like this. You want to protect against phishing, you want to protect against malware and ransomware, you want to protect against vulnerable and outdated components, you want to protect against cross-site scripting, and you want to protect against insecure direct object references. But then we get to the next common problem, which is that even if you are aware of the threats, in some cases we see companies that either haven't decided on how to mitigate against those threats, or that it's not really communicated and people are not really aligned on that strategy, how to mitigate the threat. So phishing, for instance, maybe you know it's a threat, but there's no action on protecting against it. Or for cross-site scripting, most people know that it's an issue. Developers try to be careful around it, but maybe no one has explicitly said that we're going to use our programming framework in this particular way, and that's going to protect us in most cases. Maybe they haven't decided that this is always going to be a part of our code review to have this in mind. So then it's more about making people aware and communicating the plan to protect against it. So do some research, and your list might look something like this. You raise awareness, you keep software updated, you don't give people more access than what they need. For components, software components, you make sure that they are always up to date as much as possible. And code review is another important mitigation tactic in this example. Then we are getting to the last common security problem at smaller software companies: lack of security testing. If you have everything else in place, but you don't do security testing, it is very likely that you have critical security vulnerabilities in your software. So I'm going to go through 4 pieces of advice, 4 techniques that you can use if you don't have anything in place already. I should also say, by the way, that one problem is not having any tools in place, but another related problem is also that a company might rely too much on one single tool. They might overestimate the value of one particular tool. So let's say you're using SonarQube or you're using Detectify, and you imagine that using this one tool will cover you. That tool will find all or most security vulnerabilities. which unfortunately is not true. If you want to do a really good job, you need multiple tools, multiple techniques. So first of all, if you don't have a channel for responsible disclosure, that's, I think, a natural place to start. You want to give your customers or other security researchers an open and friendly and safe channel to tell you that your software has a vulnerability. And if you do that, post a page on your website called Responsible Disclosure, put an email there that you actively monitor, and explain that, if you tell us, we're going to be very grateful. You don't have to provide rewards, but thanks or Hall of Fame or some swag doesn't hurt. And then at least you will avoid problems where people might know of security vulnerabilities, but they don't really know what to do with them, or they might be afraid to tell you. Another thing that is very good to have in place, and if you don't, this is also a good place to start, is to use tools that will scan the code that you are developing. Static application security testing. Good advice is to build this into your build pipeline so that these tests are run frequently, and then you are able to detect possible security vulnerabilities very early in the development process and not after it's in production and in the hands of customers and users. Then we also have web scanning tools. This is able to find security vulnerabilities in a different way, not looking at the code, but scanning a running web application. So this could be a test environment or a production environment. And if you are not scanning your web application, certainly someone else have already done it. So it's a good thing to scan it yourself so that you can address issues as quickly as possible. And then finally, most of the software, most of the products that we make these days, other people have written more of the code than we have, right? We rely heavily on third-party components and libraries that we import into our software. And of course, those can be vulnerable as well. They will be. So you can use dependency scanning tools to check what components are you actually using and depending on. How old are they? Do you need to update them? Do they have known vulnerabilities in them? It's surprising to me how many smaller software companies still have very manual processes around this, where they are maybe subscribed to some newsletters, or they have a calendar appointment every month or every quarter to check that their components are up to date. Most package managers that you use to include third-party software will have functionality to tell you whether you have dependencies that are out of date or not. And even if you don't use package managers, or then you can use dedicated software for this. And for all of these categories of tools that I've just talked about, you can go to owasp.org and you'll find lists of free or inexpensive tools in all of these categories. So this does not have to be expensive. And if you're starting from scratch, you don't have to adopt everything immediately. Start small and improve gradually. So now we have looked at the 5 most common security shortcomings of small software companies, and I think this could also be used as a blueprint if you're starting from scratch. These are the steps that you can take to get up to a decent level of security in a short amount of time. It doesn't take a huge amount of investment. And you can also use this as a guide if you want to evaluate other software companies. So here's the questions that you can ask yourself, or vendors, or partners, or others. Who are responsible for making sure that the organization builds and delivers secure software? And how does that actually happen in practice? does the organization have sufficient security competence, and how do you make sure that you stay up to date? What threats are most relevant and most important for your company? And what mitigation strategies have you decided on to protect against those threats? And finally, which types of security testing do you perform and how often? And if you can, you can also ask for the results of these security testing activities. So we are making software that is processing a lot of personal and sensitive information. And many of these software companies that I'm talking about today in this danger zone are doing so as well. And when we do that, we have a responsibility to do that in a secure way. And we have seen today that it's actually not that hard to improve the security level significantly if you're starting from scratch. So let's make software more secure together. Thank you.